welcome back to the channel. Today we're doing a full breakdown of one of the most fascinating and genuinely contentious debates in all of tech investing right now, Intel versus Taiwan Semiconductor. And look, I want to be upfront, this one is complicated. The bull case for Intel is real and it's specific, it's not just vibes. But so is the bear case, and the numbers don't lie. So today we're going to walk through the business, the financials, the technology battle, the geopolitics, the packaging crisis, and what a potential foundry duopoly could actually look like. As always, nothing in this video is financial advice. Do your own research, talk to a professional, and make decisions that fit your own situation. So first, who are we actually talking about here? TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, is the world's dominant pure-play foundry. They don't design chips. They manufacture them for everyone else. Apple, Nvidia, AMD, Qualcomm. Every major fabless chip company on the planet runs through TSMC's fabs. Intel, on the other hand, is historically a vertically integrated chip maker. They design and manufacture their own x86 processors, and they're now making an audacious bet to open their factories to external customers through Intel Foundry Services. The thesis here is essentially, can Intel reinvent itself as a serious foundry competitor to TSMC, or is this a trillion-dollar mistake in slow motion? That's the question we're spending the next 10+ minutes on. Let's talk about what TSMC actually does in more detail, because understanding their business model is essential context for everything that follows. TSMC operates what are called high-volume fabs, massive, incredibly expensive semiconductor manufacturing facilities that run essentially 24/7. Their customers pay a per-wafer fee, and TSMC's entire competitive advantage is built on being the most reliable, highest-yield manufacturer of the world's most advanced logic chips. Their current leading nodes are N3, which is 3nm class, and they're ramping N2 right now. The business model is elegantly simple: be the best manufacturer, attract the best customers. Those customers fund your next-generation process development, and the cycle compounds. Apple alone has historically underwritten a huge chunk of TSMC's early node development costs by committing to leading-edge volume years in advance. Now, Intel's business model is genuinely more complex, and honestly, that complexity is part of why the stock is so hard to value. Intel still derives the majority of its revenue from the client computing group, that's your laptops and desktops, and the data center and AI group. But layered on top is Intel Foundry Services, which is the external manufacturing business they're trying to build. The problem is that IFS is early stage and deeply unprofitable, while the legacy PC business is facing secular headwinds. So you have a company simultaneously managing a declining core business, funding a massive capital-intensive foundry build-out, and trying to compete technologically with the most formidable semiconductor manufacturer in history. That's a lot of plates to keep spinning. Alright, financials. And I'm not going to sugarcoat this, Intel's numbers are rough. Revenue came in at $52.9 billion, which sounds big, but it's down 4.1% year over year. Net income was negative, $267 million. That's essentially break even at the net level, which on a $52 billion revenue base is a signal of how much structural cost and capital investment is eating into results. The gross margin sits at 34.8%, which is actually the most important single number here because it tells you how much money Intel keeps after paying for the actual manufacturing of its chips. That 34.8% reflects poor fab utilization, yield challenges, and a general lack of pricing power. Compare that to TSMC's gross margin of approximately 59%, and you start to understand the full scale of the challenge. Free cash flow is where things get really uncomfortable for Intel. They're running a negative free cash flow of $4.5 billion, which represents about negative 8.5% of revenue. That means Intel is burning cash at scale right now. TSMC, by contrast, generates strongly positive free cash flow, because they have the utilization rates, the yields, and the pricing power to turn revenue into actual cash. Intel's total debt is $46.6 billion against $114 billion in equity, giving a debt-to-equity ratio of about 0.41, which is manageable but not trivial. The current ratio of 2 says they can cover near-term obligations. But the deeper question is, how many years of negative free cash flow the balance sheet can absorb before external capital becomes a necessity rather than an option? Now let's talk about the technology battle, because this is where it gets genuinely fascinating. There are two simultaneous revolutions happening in semiconductor manufacturing right now: the transition to gate-all-around transistors and the introduction of backside power delivery networks. These aren't incremental improvements, they're fundamental architectural shifts. Intel has decided to deploy both simultaneously on its 18A node. TSMC, taking a more conservative approach, is rolling out GAA transistors on N2 first, and holding back its backside power delivery, called the superpower rail, until the A16 node. This is the central philosophical contrast in the industry right now. Intel is leapfrogging, TSMC is evolving. Both strategies have merit, and both carry real risk. Here's the specific comparison on backside power delivery, because I think it's underappreciated how technically nuanced this debate is. Intel's Power Via on 18A uses nanoscale through silicon vias, NTSVs, to route power from the backside of the wafer, freeing up frontside metal layers entirely for signal routing. This enables roughly 90% standard cell utilization and gives an estimated 6% plus performance gain at identical power versus traditional front-side power delivery designs. Intel has an estimated 18-month head start on TSMC in deploying this technology at any meaningful scale. But, and this is a real but, TSMC's superpower rail on A16 is architecturally more aggressive. It physically connects directly to the GAA nanosheet source and drain contacts from the backside, bypassing metal layers in a more fundamental way than Intel's NTSV approach. So Intel got there first, but TSMC may end up doing it better when A16 enters high-volume manufacturing in the second half of 2026. Now let's talk raw manufacturing density, because this is where TSMC's advantages are most concrete and quantifiable. TSMC's N2 node achieves an estimated high-density standard cell density of around 313 million transistors per square millimeter. Intel's 18A comes in at approximately 238 million transistors per square millimeter. That's a real gap, roughly 31% more transistors per unit area on N2 versus 18A. Intel partially offsets this through the power via routing efficiency we just talked about. Freeing front-side metal layers means the effective routed density is better than the raw 2D number suggests. But partially offsetting and fully closing are very different things. And here's the compounding problem. TSMC produced approximately 12.9 million wafer starts annually across its nodes. Intel's 18A external volumes are estimated at perhaps 0.65 to 1.3 million 12-inch equivalent wafers per year. More wafer starts means more empirical yield data per quarter, which means TSMC's manufacturing learning curve compounds faster. This is a structural advantage that doesn't show up in any single technology spec. Here's something that doesn't get enough airtime in most semiconductor discussions. The most acute bottleneck for AI hardware right now isn't the cutting-edge logic node, it's advanced packaging. TSMC's chip-on-wafer on substrate platform is how NVIDIA connects its HBM memory stacks to its GPU dies in products like the H100 and H200. And chip-on-wafer on substrate capacity is essentially sold out through 2025 and into 2026. We're talking about leading-edge wafer demand outpacing available packaging capacity by roughly 3 times. Every major AI hardware program, from hyperscaler custom ASICs to NVIDIA's next-generation accelerators, is to some degree capacity constrained by TSMC's packaging throughput, not its logic fab capacity. This creates a rare and time-limited window for Intel. Intel's EMIB and Foveros platforms are genuinely competitive packaging technologies. EMIB is Intel's 2.5D interconnect approach. It uses a small silicon bridge embedded in the package substrate to connect multiple chiplets with high bandwidth and low latency, without requiring a full interposer like chip-on-wafer on substrate does. Foveros is Intel's 3D stacking technology, enabling face-to-face die stacking with through-silicon vias. And then there's UCIe Universal Chiplet Interconnect Express, which Intel has championed as an open industry standard. UCIe 2 targets over 20 terabits per second per millimeter of bandwidth with sub-4 nanosecond latency, and it supports native 3D packaging. The strategic vision here is to break TSMC's monolithic design lock-in by enabling customers to mix chiplets from different foundries in a single package. If UCIe gets adopted broadly by major fabless designers, it fundamentally changes the competitive dynamics. Now let's talk geopolitics, because this is genuinely Intel's structural moat, and it's one that no process roadmap advancement can replicate. The Taiwan Strait is a real geopolitical risk that most semiconductor supply chain models have historically underpriced. TSMC's most advanced manufacturing is geographically concentrated in Taiwan. Their Arizona fabs, by law and by design, are constrained to run nodes that are 1 to 2 generations behind what's available in Taiwan. This dynamic creates a fascinating tension. The N1 rule structurally limits TSMC, the company, but serves as a vital survival mechanism for Taiwan, the country. For TSMC as a business, this constraint hurts. It artificially kneecaps the commercial appeal of their multi-billion-dollar U.S. fabs because they cannot offer top-tier clients their absolute best technology on American soil. However, for Taiwan, this is the ultimate silicon shield. By legally hoarding the bleeding-edge nodes onshore, Taiwan forces the global economy to rely on the island's stability, ensuring that Western powers have a vested interest in defending it. Consequently, even as TSMC builds out U.S. capacity, a customer at the Arizona fab is not getting TSMC's most advanced process. They're getting N4 or N3 while Taiwan runs N2 and A16. Add to that the proposed 32% tariffs on Taiwanese semiconductors, and suddenly the math for U.S. buyers starts looking radically different. This is where Intel aggressively enters the picture. As the geopolitical friction increases, Intel Foundry stands as the only Western-based source of bleeding-edge logic. While TSMC is legally bound to keep its best tech in Asia, Intel is pushing its frontier nodes domestically, running 18A today and targeting 14A by 2027. Intel is leveraging this exact vulnerability to build its business. While Intel's massive fab buildouts represent a heavy capital burden, U.S. CHIPS Act subsidies are stepping in to partially offset their negative free cash flow and de-risk the timeline, because of the combined weight of Taiwan's straight risks, potential tariffs, and the N1 limitations on TSMC Arizona. Defense contractors and hyperscalers with strict domestic security requirements essentially become a captive customer base for IFS. They need the bleeding edge, they need it secure, and increasingly, Intel is the only foundry legally and geographically positioned to provide it. Let me give you some context on wafer economics in the Angstrom era. Because these numbers are genuinely staggering, and they matter for understanding who can actually afford to be a customer at the leading edge. A 3nm class wafer from TSMC costs somewhere in the $18,000 to $25,000 range to produce. Early N2 wafers are estimated to reach around $30,000 per wafer. EUV mask sets, the photomasks used to pattern the chips, can run $30 to $50 million each. At those price points, only a very narrow set of products can justify a monolithic die at the leading edge: KI accelerators, flagship smartphone, SoCs, high-end CPUs. This means both TSMC and Intel's leading-edge revenue is increasingly concentrated in a small number of high-stakes customers. And it's why Intel's negative free cash flow situation is so precarious. You need volume to amortize these fixed costs. And IFS doesn't have the volume yet. The bull case for Intel is genuinely compelling if you accept a few key premises. The 18A node is real, PowerVia is an 18-month lead in backside power delivery, and the geopolitical tailwinds are structural and durable. If IFS can land one or two hyperscaler or defense contractor design wins on 18A, the narrative shifts overnight. The 14A node targeting 2027 with high NA EUV and second-generation PowerDirect BSPDN could put Intel at parity or ahead of TSMC's A16. And if that happens, the foundry business becomes a genuine second revenue engine. Intel's market cap of $228 billion versus TSMC's $1.73 trillion means even a partial foundry turnaround represents enormous upside from current levels. And chips. ACT subsidies provide a meaningful buffer that reduces balance sheet risk during the transition. The bear case is equally specific and honestly harder to dismiss. TSMC's N2 density advantage of 313 versus 238 million transistors per millimeter squared is real and proven. Their execution track record over the past decade is essentially immaculate. They haven't missed a major node transition in memory. Intel's 18A external volumes are still tiny compared to TSMC's manufacturing scale, and every quarter of low volume means slower yield learning. The PE ratio of roughly 46 times on near-zero earnings is optically expensive. There's almost no margin of safety if 18A yields disappoint or IFS customer wins slip to the right. And then there's the Apple question. Can Intel actually win Apple Silicon business? The 2015 chipgate precedent, where TSMC A9 variants showed up to 10% better battery life than Intel manufactured equivalents, created lasting reputational damage. Apple, dual sourcing a monolithic M-series chip across Intel, ATA, and TSM, CN2, is genuinely unrealistic near term. So let's close out with the duopoly question, because I think it's the most important strategic frame for where this all goes. Right now, the foundry market is essentially a TSMC monopoly at the leading edge. The question is whether Intel can establish a genuine second pole in the market, not to displace TSMC, but to create a world where major customers have a credible alternative. The most realistic near-term pathway isn't Apple migrating its entire M-series SoC to Intel ADA. That's not happening. What's realistic is chiplet-based diversification, Apple sourcing mature I/O dies or AI acceleration tiles from IFS via EMIB packaging while keeping TSMC for the primary compute dies. That avoids another chipgate event, gives Apple supply chain optionality, and gives Intel a prestigious, high-profile beachhead customer. If UCIe becomes a genuine industry standard, this kind of cross-foundry chiplet sourcing becomes much easier for any fabless designer, not just Apple. A true duopoly would be structurally healthy for the industry and transformative for Intel's valuation. But it requires Intel to execute over a multi-year horizon without stumbling, which is the core risk. So where does this all land? Last time we covered this, we were neutral, and honestly, that's still where I sit. The Intel bull case is one of the most technically interesting and structurally motivated investment theses I've come across in semiconductors. The geopolitical moat is real. The packaging window is real. The 18A technology, while unproven at scale, is genuinely impressive. But the bear case is equally grounded. TSMC's density lead is measurable, their execution track record is nearly perfect. And Intel's financials, negative free cash flow, thin gross margins, near zero net income, reflect the company in the most expensive phase of its reinvention with no guarantee of success. At roughly 46 times earnings on near zero earnings, there's very little margin of safety priced in. This is a high-conviction speculative position if you believe in the 18A and 14A roadmap, not a value play. If that execution comes through, the upside is enormous. If it doesn't, the downside is severe. That's the bet. That's the full breakdown on Intel versus TSMC. Honestly, this one took a while to work through because there are real, substantive arguments on both sides. This isn't a case where one company is obviously right and the other is obviously wrong. TSMC is one of the greatest businesses ever built. Intel is attempting one of the most ambitious industrial turnarounds in semiconductor history. Whether that turnaround succeeds is genuinely uncertain, and that uncertainty is exactly what makes it interesting to analyze. If you found this useful, drop a like. It actually helps a lot with getting this content in front of more people. And I'd love to hear your take in the comments. Are you in the Intel camp, the TSMC camp, or somewhere in between? Any corrections, pushback, or things I missed, let me know. See you in the next one.